The Germans were laughing. Encircled in Bastogne, the Americans seemed doomed. Snow piled high, winter winds biting, and the town trapped like a cage. Hitler's forces were certain of victory. But then, with calm authority that masked the storm of battle he would unleash, General George Patton spoke just 2 words that would change everything: play the ball. In that moment, the fate of the Ardennes, and perhaps the entire Western Front, teetered on the edge. What seemed impossible, a trapped army breaking free, turning the tables on Germany's deadliest winter offensive, was about to become America's most audacious triumph. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, a frozen wilderness in the heart of Europe, became the stage for Hitler's boldest gamble. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the last desperate thrust of a faltering Third Reich, hit the Allies like a thunderclap. Across Belgium and Luxembourg, 29 German divisions, 250,000 men, over 1,000 tanks surged forward, exploiting the quiet of winter mornings and Allied overconfidence. Entire American units were shattered in hours, communications broke down, and chaos gripped Allied command posts. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction, was surrounded, isolated, and seemingly lost. Meanwhile, the Germans mocked the trapped Americans. They believed these soldiers, inexperienced and ill-prepared for winter combat, would crumble under pressure. They were confident, arrogant, certain that their surprise offensive would sever the Allied front and force a negotiated peace. But the Germans didn't account for one thing: General George Smith Patton Jr., the commander of the Third Army. At 59, Patton was no stranger to audacious maneuvers. A lifetime dedicated to military mastery had forged him into a relentless, aggressive tactician. He had led America's first tank units in World War I, earned fame in North Africa and Sicily, and carved a reputation as the most feared and unpredictable Allied general. His troops knew him as a man who would ride into danger alongside them, demanding excellence and inspiring courage with every action. Patton's Third Army, numbering over 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks, was poised in eastern France, preparing for a thrust into Germany's industrial heart. What the Germans saw as an easy conquest, the encircled Americans at Bastogne was about to meet a force prepared, not only to resist, but to strike back with precision and ferocity. And when the moment came, Patton would not simply react. He would anticipate, innovate, and unleash an offensive so bold it would stun friend and foe alike. The morning of December 16, 1944, dawned with a silence that belied the chaos about to erupt. Hitler's last gamble, his surprise offensive through the Ardennes, was already in motion. German troops surged through frozen forests, their tanks crunching over icy roads, their artillery carving destruction in the thinly defended American lines. Within hours, entire divisions of the U.S. First Army were fragmented, disoriented, and retreating under relentless pressure. Bastogne, a critical road hub connecting multiple supply routes, became the focal point of this blitzkrieg. Trapped and outnumbered, American soldiers dug in, facing temperatures far below freezing, mud and snow slowing every movement, weapons seizing from the cold, from the chaos of command centers in Verdun to the snow-choked front lines. The Allies were in shock. Reports of German success poured in, each one worse than the last. The Germans, sensing victory, taunted the Americans. Loudspeakers broadcast messages of surrender. Radio intercepts carried their laughter, mocking the trapped Yankees. To most Allied commanders, the situation appeared hopeless. Many feared Bastogne would fall before any relief could arrive, not that the Ardennes would become a German corridor to Antwerp, splitting the Allies and forcing a humiliating negotiation. But General George Patton saw what others could not. While Eisenhower and his staff wrestled with panic, Patton's mind was already several moves ahead. He prepared for scenarios like this, anticipating that Hitler might attempt a surprise winter offensive. His intelligence officers had observed unusual German movements weeks earlier, drafting multiple contingency plans for a northward turn toward the Ardennes. And now, as the grim reports reached him, Patton's experience and intuition crystallized into decisive action without hesitation. He convened his staff and issued a simple, electrifying order: play the ball. was two words activated: a complex, pre-planned operation. Patton's Third Army, over 133,000 men. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks, and support vehicles would pivot north, a maneuver that seemed impossible under the bitterest winter conditions. Snowstorms blanketed the roads, engines threatened to freeze. Supplies had to move faster than ever imagined, and morale had to be maintained as soldiers endured blizzards, frostbite, and exhaustion. Yet Patton's leadership style turned obstacles into opportunities. He refused to hide in command bunkers. Instead, he drove through the icy landscape in an open jeep. His winter parka stiffened with frost, inspecting units, rallying troops, and instilling confidence. "We are the finest soldiers in the world," he reminded them. "This is our finest hour." His presence and words spread through the ranks like wildfire, raising morale, sharpening focus, and preparing men for a march that would defy conventional military thinking. German commanders, meanwhile, remained blind to the impending threat. Their arrogance and overconfidence were compounded by the harshest winter in decades. They assumed the Americans would be bogged down. Their response slowed by the same snow and ice that plagued them. The Wehrmacht underestimated Patton's audacity and the resilience of his soldiers. By the time the Third Army began its pivot, the Germans were already behind the curve, unaware that their overextension and daring gamble had sown the seeds of their own undoing. As the first armored columns rumbled northward, slicing through frozen forests and treacherous roads, the stage was set for one of the most extraordinary relief operations in military history. Bastogne, surrounded and beleaguered, would soon witness a force that refused to bow, commanded by a general who embodied the audacity, brilliance, and relentless drive of American arms. The battle lines of the Ardennes were about to shift, and the Germans' laughter would soon turn to shock. December 19th, 1944, Bastogne lay encircled, and the Germans felt victory within their grasp. Snowflakes fell thick, covering ruined roads and frozen fields, as artillery shells tore through trees and buildings. American soldiers, exhausted and outnumbered, clung to foxholes and barricades, determined not to surrender. The town had become a fortress of hope and defiance, yet survival depended on one thing: relief. Meanwhile, over 100 miles away, Patton's Third Army executed one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. The pivot northward, a maneuver that would challenge logistics, endurance, and every assumption about winter warfare, was underway. Tanks, trucks, artillery, and infantry columns moved with precision through snow-choked roads, engines sputtering, and crews battling frostbite. The 4th Armored Division led the charge, followed by the 26th Infantry Division and the 81st Infantry Division, carrying vital supplies and ammunition to sustain the trapped defenders. Patton, riding through the columns in his open jeep, embodied leadership under fire. His winter parka coated with frost, he inspected vehicles, offered encouragement, and reminded his soldiers that success demanded audacity and unity. "Attack," he urged. "Always attack. The enemy is weaker than he appears." His presence was more than symbolic, it was transformative. Soldiers, inspired by his example, pressed forward despite blizzards, icy roads, and enemy harassment. Each mile brought them closer to Bastogne, and each mile struck at the confidence of the Germans who believed their encirclement was unbreakable. The Germans, confident in their winter assault, were caught off guard. General Erich Brandenberger of the 7th Army expected a delayed or disorganized response. What he saw instead was a well-coordinated, disciplined, and relentless advance. Tanks and infantry moved in tandem, artillery fire covered their approach, and American engineers cleared obstacles with speed that defied expectations. The Wehrmacht had underestimated both the capabilities of Patton's forces and the resolve of the American soldiers under his command. Back in Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held firm, their spirits buoyed by rumors of Patton's relief. When German envoys demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with one word: nuts. The message spread across the beleaguered town, symbolizing unwavering American determination. soldiers clung to hope, believing that the audacious general leading the relief would arrive before despair could take hold by the afternoon of December 22nd. The leading elements of Patton's army clashed with German positions just miles from Bastogne. Tanks roared, infantry engaged in fierce firefights, and snowfields became battle-scarred arenas of destruction. The German forces, unprepared for this sudden counteroffensive, faltered, their supply lines strained, units exhausted, and morale breaking. They could not match the coordination, speed, and ferocity of the Third Army. In this moment, the impossible became reality. Patton's bold gamble, executed under brutal winter conditions, was beginning to turn the tide. Bastogne, once a trapped town, was on the verge of salvation. The laughter of the Germans, their mocking confidence, was fading into the cold Ardennes wind, replaced by a growing sense of alarm and desperation. The stage was set for a full-scale American counterattack that would not only relieve Bastogne, but reshape the entire Battle of the Bulge. Inside Bastogne, the situation was grim. The town, surrounded on all sides, was a fortress under siege, its defenders battered by relentless German assaults. Snow clogged the streets, freezing men in place while artillery shells tore through buildings and streets. Yet the Americans held their ground. The 101st Airborne Division, along with scattered units, had fortified positions and dug in as deep as the frozen earth would allow. Morale was fraying under the weight of isolation, hunger, and bitter cold, but hope persisted. Every day, the Germans demanded surrender. Every day, the answer was defiance. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's now famous reply, "Nuts," had become a symbol of the unyielding American spirit. Soldiers repeated the word with defiant smiles, even as the enemy's tanks and artillery bore down on their positions. In those tense hours, every man in Bastogne understood that survival depended on reinforcements. Everyone prayed that General Patton's Third Army could pierce the German encirclement. Meanwhile, Patton's forces advanced relentlessly. Snowstorms and icy roads slowed some columns, yet engineers and soldiers pressed on, clearing obstacles and keeping vehicles moving. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded the relief, followed closely by infantry and supply convoys. Artillery units laid suppressive fire along German positions, softening the resistance and creating corridors for the advance. Patton's operational brilliance was evident. Rather than attacking where the Germans were strongest, he struck at their exposed flanks, exploiting the very overconfidence that had led Hitler to gamble everything on this offensive. Back in Bastogne, the defenders could hear distant artillery fire, the first sounds of relief. Each boom echoed hope, each rumble a promise that the Germans' laughter might soon be silenced. Soldiers shared stories of Patton's reputation, the general who had led tanks across deserts and through Sicily, the man who never retreated and never hesitated. Knowing that such a force was coming energized weary troops, infusing them with renewed courage to hold their lines. The psychological battle was as crucial as the physical one. The Germans had assumed the Americans would break under pressure. Yet here was evidence to the contrary. As the snow fell, the defenders' spirits strengthened with every report of Patton's approach. American troops, battered but resolute, prepared for the imminent link-up, aware that the tide of the Ardennes could turn in a single day. By December 22nd, Patton's lead units clashed with German outposts on the outskirts of Bastogne. The noise of tanks, gunfire, and shouting signaled the beginning of a historic counteroffensive. The trapped Americans now had hope. The Germans were shocked, and the frozen Ardennes became the stage for an epic confrontation that would test strategy, endurance, and courage like never before. Bastogne was no longer a symbol of isolation. It had become the heart of a turning battle, where audacity and determination would decide the fate of an entire winter. Offensive. December 23, 1944. The frozen roads of the Ardennes carried the roar of American tanks and the march of infantry as Patton's Third Army closed in on Bastogne. Snow whipped through the air, stinging exposed faces, while exhausted soldiers pressed forward with relentless determination. For the men trapped in Bastogne, the distant sound of engines and artillery was more than just a signal. It was salvation. Hope, which had been a fragile ember in the heart of winter, Now blazed into certainty, the relief force moved with precision that seemed impossible given the bitter conditions. Columns of tanks led the advance, supported by infantry units navigating icy streets and frozen fields. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear obstacles and repair bridges, ensuring that supplies, ammunition, winter gear, and medical provisions reached the front lines without delay. Patton's operational foresight was evident in every movement. He had chosen the route that struck the Germans where they were most vulnerable, avoiding their strongest positions and targeting the overextended flanks of the Wehrmacht. Inside Bastogne, the American defenders prepared for the historic link-up. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, their weapons frozen, their bodies numb from the cold, yet spirits unbroken. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his staff coordinated with incoming forces, transmitting messages of encouragement and readiness. When the vanguard of Patton's columns finally appeared on the horizon, a roar of relief and determination surged from the defenders. The siege had ended. Bastogne had been saved. The German forces, caught off guard by the speed and audacity of the American maneuver, scrambled to respond. Their meticulously planned offensive, relying on precise timing and coordination, began to unravel. Supply lines were stretched thin, morale faltered, and exhaustion took its toll. Patton's forces, exploiting every weakness, struck decisively, pushing German units back and preventing any chance of regrouping. Tanks clashed across frozen fields, infantry engaged in fierce firefights, and artillery pummeled positions that had once seemed secure. The impact of Patton's actions went beyond the immediate relief of Bastogne. By opening the corridor, he not only saved a critical town and its defenders, but also set in motion a broader counteroffensive that would unravel Hitler's last gamble in the Ardennes. The Third Army's advance demonstrated the combination of audacious strategy, logistical genius, and inspirational leadership that defined Patton. Soldiers who had once feared encirclement now marched forward with confidence, knowing that their general had transformed an impossible situation into a decisive advantage. By December 26th, the breakthrough was complete. Bastogne linked to reinforcements. The German encirclement shattered, and the frozen forests of the Ardennes bore witness to a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. Patton's gamble had succeeded, not just in relieving a trapped garrison, but in reversing the momentum of an offensive designed to split the Allies and alter the course of the war. The snow, once a symbol of despair and isolation, now marked the path of triumph, as audacity, courage, leadership combined to secure one of America's most significant victories. With Bastogne relieved, Patton's Third Army did not pause. The frozen Ardennes, once a symbol of German dominance, became a theater of relentless American counterattacks. Tanks roared across snow-laden fields, their tracks crushing ice and mud, while infantry advanced with unyielding determination. Artillery barrages shattered German defenses, and every movement was executed with the precision of a general who had anticipated every contingency. Patton's genius was not merely in lifting the siege of Bastogne, it was in turning a defensive stalemate into a full-scale offensive juggernaut. German units, battered by overextension and poor winter conditions, were forced into chaotic retreats. Tigers and Panthers, once symbols of invincibility, were outmaneuvered by Shermans and tank destroyers exploiting terrain and speed. Ammunition shortages and frozen engines slowed their response, while American artillery and air support punished every exposed position. Patton's advance was relentless. He struck not only to relieve besieged towns, but to exploit weaknesses, cut off supply lines, inflict maximum casualties. The men of the Third Army felt the intensity of their general's presence in every engagement. Patton rode through the front lines in his open jeep, frost clinging to his uniform, personally observing assaults, redirecting fire. Split forward to press forward, despite fatigue and freezing conditions. His audacity and visible leadership instilled confidence that transformed fear into ferocity. The American soldiers were no longer simply fighting for survival. They were hunting or retreating to a disoriented enemy in villages and forests across the Ardennes. Fierce firefights raged. German officers, once arrogant in their expectation of victory, struggled to maintain cohesion. Morale collapsed as the reality of Patton's counterattack became undeniable. Units were encircled, forced to surrender, or destroyed entirely. The snow, once pristine, became stained with the consequences of relentless combat. American forces, disciplined and coordinated, inflicted a toll the Wehrmacht could not recover from. Air support, coordinated with Patton's ground maneuvers, struck German positions with devastating effect. Fighter bombers tore through armored columns, targeting bridges and supply depots, while artillery coordinated precise barrages to disrupt retreating units. A combination of mobility, firepower, and timing left German forces reeling, unable to regroup or mount a counter. By January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had been decisively turned. Patton's strategy, blending audacity with meticulous planning, had transformed what could have been a disastrous winter for the Allies into a demonstration of American operational brilliance. The Germans, who had once mocked Bastogne's defenders, were now in full retreat, their forces shattered and their ambitions destroyed. Patton's Third Army had not merely survived, it had dominated, proving that leadership, preparation, and relentless action could overcome even the harshest winter and the most formidable foe. As the Ardennes winter pressed on, the Germans struggled to regain composure. Their once coordinated offensive had become a series of disjointed retreats. Supply lines were shattered, communication faltered, and morale plummeted. Units composed of young boys, older men, and exhausted veterans faltered under relentless American pressure. The laughter that had echoed through Bastogne just days before was now replaced by the grim realization of defeat. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army pressed forward with unstoppable momentum. Every maneuver was executed with precision honed through years of preparation. Tanks and infantry moved in perfect coordination. Artillery covered every advance, and engineers cleared roads blocked by snow, fallen trees, and destroyed bridges. The winter landscape that had seemed a disadvantage to most became a battlefield that Patton exploited, turning frozen rivers, icy roads, and snow-covered fields into strategic advantages against overextended German forces. Inside the American ranks, morale soared. Soldiers who had endured weeks of siege and exhaustion now found themselves part of a counteroffensive that not only relieved Bastogne, but punished the Germans for their audacity. Patton's presence on the front lines, his constant inspections, and his inspiring words transformed fatigue into determination. "This is our finest hour," he reminded them, and they believed it. Each town liberated, each enemy position overrun, reinforced the confidence of men who now fought not only for survival, but for victory. German commanders were forced to acknowledge the scale of their miscalculation. Overconfidence, winter hardships, and Patton's audacious maneuvers had created a situation they could not recover from. Tanks and infantry columns, once symbols of German military might, were now targets for relentless American assaults. Retreats turned into routs, and attempts to reorganize were repeatedly thwarted by coordinated strikes from Patton's forces. The psychological impact on the battlefield was profound. The Americans, once besieged and demoralized, had become hunters, dictating the pace and location of engagements. German soldiers, who had once taunted their enemies, now fled under the pressure of a relentless and inspired army. The winter of 1944 had transformed from a tool of the Germans into a weapon of Patton's strategic genius as the Third Army continued to push north and west. Every advance widened the gap between overextended German forces and their objectives. Bastogne, once a symbol of American resilience, now served as a launching point for a broader counteroffensive. Patton's audacity had created a domino effect across the Ardennes, turning what had begun as a desperate defensive struggle into a decisive campaign that showcased the power of preparation, leadership, and relentless execution. The Germans, once mocking, now faced the unyielding force of American strategy. Speed and courage, a force that would not relent until the winter offensive was utterly defeated by early January 1945. The consequences of Patton's audacious counteroffensive were undeniable. The German advance through the Ardennes had been not merely halted, but decisively reversed. Bastogne, once a symbol of entrapment and despair, had become a launching point for the relentless push that shattered Hitler's last winter gamble. Overextended German divisions, deprived of fuel, supplies, and morale, faltered under constant pressure from tanks, infantry, and artillery coordinated with expert precision. The Third Army, moving with the speed and determination that had become Patton's hallmark, inflicted heavy casualties on the retreating Germans. Frozen fields and forests, once a hindrance, became arenas of tactical advantage for the Americans. Patton's ability to maintain coordination across multiple divisions in harsh winter conditions demonstrated logistical genius. Supply lines held firm, reinforcements arrived where needed, every unit moved as part of a larger, unstoppable force. American soldiers, from the battle-hardened veterans of North Africa and Sicily to the newly trained infantrymen, showcased a professionalism, resilience that surprised the enemy at every turn. Tanks clashed with German Panthers and Tigers. Infantry stormed fortified positions, and artillery barrages tore through the enemy's lines. Even as winter's harshest conditions tested men and machines alike, morale remained high, fueled by Patton's visible leadership and relentless insistence on offensive action. The Germans, once mocking the trapped Americans in Bastogne, now faced the stark reality of defeat. Units surrendered en masse, supply depots fell, and entire formations disintegrated under the combined pressure of ground forces and air support. Hitler's ambitious plan, designed to split the Allies and force a negotiated peace, was reduced to ruins. The Ardennes offensive had exhausted the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserves, leaving German forces weakened and demoralized. Patton's impact extended beyond the immediate battlefield, by relieving Bastogne and exploiting weaknesses. In the German offensive, he not only saved thousands of American lives, but also ensured the continuity of the Allied advance into Germany. The Third Army's actions turned a defensive struggle into a decisive victory, solidifying American dominance on the Western Front. Bastogne, the snow-encircled town that had seemed doomed, now stood as a testament to audacity, preparation, leadership. By January 16th, when forces from the north and south finally linked up, the Bulge had been eliminated. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men, with over 700 tanks and 1,600 aircraft destroyed. The laughter that had once echoed through Bastogne had been silenced forever, replaced by the sobering reality of defeat. Patton's Third Army had not merely survived. It had turned an impossible situation into one of the greatest triumphs of American arms during World War I. The snow of the Ardennes bore witness to the devastating consequences of Hitler's last gamble. By mid-January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated, and the shattered German forces were in full retreat. Patton's Third Army had not only relieved Bastogne, but had inflicted catastrophic losses on the Wehrmacht. Over 100,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. More than 700 tanks, once symbols of armored invincibility, lay destroyed or abandoned in frozen fields. While 1,600 aircraft were shot down, destroyed, or grounded. The offensive, meant to divide the Allies and force a negotiated peace, had collapsed entirely. The psychological impact was equally profound. German commanders, who had once mocked American inexperience and overconfidence, were forced to confront the reality that the U.S. Army was a professional, resilient, and deadly force under capable leadership. For Hitler, the Ardennes had been a gamble that drained Germany's final reserves, leaving the Wehrmacht strategically vulnerable as the Allies resumed their advance into the heart of the Reich. Bastogne, once a symbol of desperate resistance, now represented the turning of the tide, a testament to audacity, its planning and leadership under extreme adversity for the Americans. The relief of Bastogne and the decisive counterattack demonstrated the power of initiative and courage. Soldiers who had endured freezing temperatures, hunger, and relentless assaults emerged not only victorious, but emboldened. Patton's leadership became the stuff of legend, a general who could turn apparent defeat into opportunity, who refused to retreat, and who inspired men to achieve the impossible. His decision to pivot 6 divisions over frozen roads, through snowstorms and under enemy observation, remains one of the most extraordinary feats of military logistics and strategy in history. The battle also reinforced a critical lesson in warfare. Audacity, preparation, and leadership can overcome even the most daunting odds. Patton's insistence on relentless offense, his deep understanding of enemy vulnerabilities, and his ability to inspire troops proved decisive. Allied forces now held the strategic initiative in Western Europe and Germany's capacity to mount. A major winter offensive had been irrevocably broken as the snow melted and the wounded were evacuated. The Ardennes stood scarred, a battlefield transformed into a monument of sacrifice and triumph. Patton's Third Army had not only secured Bastogne, but had reshaped the course of the war in Europe. The Germans had mocked, threatened, and overextended themselves, only to discover that American resolve, led by audacity, skill, and unyielding leadership, could not be underestimated. Bastogne had survived, the Bulge had been defeated, and the stage was set for the final push into Germany. The Battle of the Bulge had come to an end. But its impact resonated far beyond the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Bastogne, once encircled, and on the brink of collapse, had survived. The Germans, who had mocked the Americans and believed victory was assured, were now in full retreat. Patton's audacious maneuver, the pivot of his Third Army through snow and ice, had turned the tide, transforming a desperate defense into a decisive American triumph. George Patton emerged from the Ardennes, not only as a master of armored warfare, but as a symbol of leadership, courage, and determination. His ability to anticipate enemy moves, inspire his troops, and execute complex operations under the harshest conditions demonstrated why he was feared by the Germans and revered by his soldiers. The snow that had trapped so many now bore witness to one of the greatest military feats of the war. The relief of Bastogne and the destruction of German forces in the Bulge solidified America's position on the Western Front. Hitler's final winter gamble had failed, and the Allies now held the momentum needed to push into Germany itself. Soldiers remembered Bastogne not for the hardship endured, but for the bravery, skill, and audacity that defined their victory in the end. The lesson of Bastogne was clear. In war, audacity, preparation, and leadership can defy the impossible. The Germans had mocked the Americans, believing them trapped and weak, only to witness the devastating power of American resolve. Patton had played the ball, and in doing so, he had not only saved Bastogne, but had turned the snow crimson with German defeat, proving that the audacity of one general could shape the fate of an entire campaign.